In February of 1887, the Breathitt County Circuit Court clerk recorded a marriage certificate. The groom, Jasper Caldwell, listed his age as 43 years. The bride, Nellie Branham, was 13. The document contained no irregularities, no legal violations. It was simply another entry in the marriage registry, as routine as any other. Before we dive into the story, quick question. What's the creepiest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. And while you're here, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The certificate itself survives in the county archives, preserved in a leather-bound volume alongside hundreds of other marriage records from that winter. The paper has yellowed with age, the ink faded to a pale brown, but the details remain legible. Jasper Caldwell signed with a firm, practiced hand. Nellie's signature appears smaller, more careful. The letters formed with the deliberate precision of someone recently taught to write. Below both signatures sits the mark of Vernon Branham, her father, providing the parental consent required by territorial law for brides under the age of 16. What the certificate does not record are the negotiations that preceded the ceremony. Documents discovered in subsequent estate proceedings reveal that Jasper Caldwell owned considerable property in the Frozen Creek area, including timberland, livestock, and a substantial 2-story frame house built on cleared bottomland near the creek. Vernon Branham farmed rented ground on the ridges above, working soil too steep and rocky for profitable cultivation. His family lived in a cabin with a dirt floor and a single window covered with oiled paper against the winter cold. The arrangement between the two men began that previous autumn, conducted through conversations at the general store where men gathered to trade goods and settle accounts. Witnesses later recalled seeing Caldwell and Branham in extended discussions, sometimes joined by the merchant who held debts against the Branham family. Land records from that period show Caldwell granted Vernon Branham timber rights to 40 acres of woodland, allowing him to cut and sell lumber. Livestock transfer documents indicate 3 breeding hogs changed hands, animals valuable enough to sustain a family through lean winters. A notation in the merchant's ledger, preserved when his store's records were donated to the Historical Society, shows a debt of $30 attributed to Vernon Branham, marked as settled by arrangement with J. Caldwell. The sum represented nearly half a year's income for a subsistence farmer in that region during that era. One witness statement, given years later during unrelated court proceedings, mentioned that Nellie herself was present at the store during one of these discussions. The witness recalled her sitting near the wood stove, quiet and watchful, while the men conducted their business. She wore a patched dress that had been lengthened with fabric of a different color, suggesting she had recently outgrown her clothing. Her hair was braided in the fashion young girls wore in that region, not yet put up in the manner expected of married women. The marriage would legally accomplish what the negotiations had arranged. Nellie Branham would cease to be a dependent child in her father's household and become Nellie Caldwell, a wife with all the duties and expectations that status carried in 1880s Kentucky. The marriage between Jasper Caldwell and Nellie Branham was not an anomaly. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. Kentucky law in the 1880s established marriage consent ages that would be unthinkable by modern standards. Girls as young as 12 could legally marry with parental approval. No judicial review was required. No investigation into the circumstances. A father's signature on the marriage certificate provided all the authorization the law demanded, and circuit court clerks processed these documents without question or comment. Archives from the Kentucky Historical Society contain legislative records spanning the entire 19th century. These documents reveal multiple attempts to raise the age of consent, each one failing in the state legislature. The pattern was consistent. Urban representatives from Louisville and Lexington would introduce reform bills. Rural lawmakers from the eastern mountain counties would oppose them. The debates, preserved in legislative journals, offer insight into the reasoning that kept these laws in place. One representative from Pike County argued in 1879 that raising marriage ages would constitute unwarranted interference in family affairs and mountain traditions. Another legislator from Leslie County stated that such restrictions would impose hardship on families who depend on practical arrangements for survival. The language was careful, sanitized, but the meaning was clear. These marriages served economic purposes that lawmakers were unwilling to disrupt. Newspaper archives from the Lexington Observer show how casually these unions were treated in public discourse. Marriage announcements appeared in the society pages alongside notices of births and deaths. A typical entry from March of 1883 reads, Mr. Elwood Thacker, aged 38, to Miss Sarah Combs, aged 14, both of Letcher County. No editorial commentary accompanied these notices. They were simply news, as unremarkable as weather reports or crop prices. The legal framework extended beyond just permitting these marriages. Court records demonstrate that once married, these girls assumed full legal status as wives. They could be sued for debts. They could testify in court. Though their testimony carried less weight than their husbands, they were expected to fulfill all domestic duties and produce children, regardless of their physical readiness. Medical journals from the period, preserved in university archives, contain scattered references to the health consequences. An 1890 article in the Kentucky Medical Journal noted complications arising from premature childbearing, without directly addressing the marriage practices that caused these complications. Doctors documented the problems, but remained largely silent on the underlying cause, perhaps recognizing that the law itself sanctioned what medicine increasingly understood to be harmful. What made the system particularly insidious was its veneer of legality and social acceptance. These were not secret arrangements conducted in shame. They were public transactions, recorded in official documents, recognized by churches and communities. The marriages appeared in census records. Children born from these unions were registered without any notation that their mothers had been children themselves when the pregnancies began. By 1890, some reform efforts began gaining traction, driven partly by women's organizations in cities and partly by physicians documenting maternal mortality rates. But in the mountain counties where economic desperation ran deepest, the old patterns continued. The law permitted it, custom endorsed it, and families like the Branhams, facing circumstances that left them few choices, participated in a system that the state itself had created and maintained. The certificate in Breathitt County represented not just one marriage, but a legal and social structure built to facilitate thousands of them. The Branham cabin sat on a ridge above Frozen Creek, accessible only by a narrow footpath that turned to mud every spring and froze solid every winter. 2 rooms, 7 children, and parents who worked land that barely sustained them through harvest season. Vernon and Martha Branham had arrived in Breathitt County in 1876, hoping to claim land under arrangements with absentee owners in Lexington. What they found instead was the opportunity to farm on shares, keeping a portion of their harvest in exchange for working ground, too poor for the landowners themselves to bother with. The arrangement kept them perpetually in debt. Seed, tools, and basic provisions came from the merchant on credit, to be repaid after harvest. But rocky soil and unpredictable weather meant harvests rarely covered what was owed. By 1886, the Branham family's situation had become desperate. Martha's health had declined following the birth of her 7th child. She could no longer manage the heavy labor of mountain farming. The oldest son, barely 16, helped his father in the fields, but their combined efforts could not overcome the fundamental problem. They had too many dependents and too little productive capacity. Letters discovered during estate proceedings decades later reveal the calculations Vernon Branham faced. His sister in Virginia had written asking why he did not simply move his family somewhere with better prospects. His response, dated October of 1886, laid out the mathematics of poverty with brutal clarity. Moving required money they did not have. Staying required solving the immediate crisis of mounting debts and insufficient labor. The letter mentioned Nellie directly, noting that arrangements might be made that would benefit all concerned. Other correspondence in the same collection shows that Vernon had received inquiries about Nellie starting when she turned 11. A widower from the next valley had sent word through a mutual acquaintance. Another man, a merchant with property in town, had made his interest known to Vernon at church. These were not courtships in any conventional sense. They were business propositions, and Vernon had delayed making any decision while Nellie remained young enough that even mountain custom hesitated. But by autumn of 1886, delay was no longer possible. The merchant held a $30 debt that Vernon could not pay. Winter was approaching, and the family had insufficient stores to last until spring. Martha's illness meant they had lost her labor permanently. Something had to give. A diary kept by a neighboring woman, donated to the County Historical Society in 1942, contains an entry from November of 1886. The woman had visited the Branham cabin and found Nellie helping her mother with washing. The diary entry describes Nellie as a child still, thin as a rail, with hands chapped from cold water and lye soap. The entry continues. Martha spoke of the marriage arrangement while Nellie was in the room. The girl said nothing, just kept working at the washing. I have seen animals in traps with less resignation in their eyes. The same diary records that Nellie attended the one-room schoolhouse sporadically, when farm work permitted. She could read simple texts and write her name, accomplishments that placed her above many children in that region. But by December, she had stopped attending school entirely. The teacher noted her absence in the attendance book without comment. Everyone understood what was coming. The general store at Frozen Creek served as more than a place of commerce. It was where men settled accounts, negotiated deals, and arranged the transactions that shaped their lives. In the autumn of 1886, Jasper Caldwell and Vernon Branham met there repeatedly, their conversations witnessed by others who understood exactly what was being discussed. Caldwell had been widowed for 3 years. His first wife had died of pneumonia, leaving him with a house that required management and fields that needed tending. At 43, he possessed what Vernon Branham desperately needed: property, livestock, and influence with the merchant who controlled credit in that area. The negotiations between them were not romantic courtship, but economic calculation, conducted with the same attention to detail as any livestock trade. Land deed records filed in January of 1887 show the first concrete result of these discussions. Caldwell granted Vernon Branham timber rights to 40 acres of woodland on the ridge above his property. The value was substantial. Timber could be cut, hauled to the railroad depot, and sold for cash money, a rare commodity in a region where most transactions occurred through barter and credit. For a man in Vernon's position, this represented potential income that could clear debts and provide security his family had never known. The second element involved livestock. Documents recording animal transfers show 3 breeding hogs moved from Caldwell's property to Vernon Branham in December of 1886. These were not ordinary animals. Breeding stock represented wealth that reproduced itself, providing meat, additional animals to sell, and ongoing value. For a family surviving on the edge of subsistence, 3 breeding hogs could mean the difference between hunger and sufficiency. The third component appeared in the merchant's ledger. The $30 debt that had hung over the Branham family was marked settled by arrangement with J. Caldwell in early December. The merchant, who attended the same church as both men and witnessed their negotiations at his store, had agreed to accept payment from Caldwell in exchange for clearing Vernon's account. The sum represented more money than Vernon could have earned in 6 months of farm labor. A court transcript from 1894 involving an unrelated property dispute contains testimony from a man who frequented the general store. He recalled seeing Caldwell and Branham in discussion there multiple times that autumn. More significantly, he remembered seeing Nellie present during at least one of these meetings. His testimony described her sitting on a bench near the wood stove, wearing a coat too large for her frame, watching the men talk. When asked what was discussed, the witness stated, "Everyone knew what was being arranged. The girl knew it too. You could see it in how she sat there, not moving, not speaking." The store owner himself, in a separate statement given to a traveling journalist in 1903, confirmed the basic facts. He remembered the negotiations, remembered marking the debt as settled, remembered Nellie's presence. When asked if he had any misgivings about facilitating such an arrangement, he responded that it was not his place to interfere in legal matters between families. The law permitted it. Custom endorsed it. His role was simply to record the transactions in his books. By January of 1887, all elements of the arrangement had been completed. Only the marriage itself remained, a formality that would legally transfer Nellie from one household to another and finalize what the negotiations had already determined. The ceremony took place at the Breathitt County Courthouse on a cold February morning in 1887. The marriage required witnesses, and Caldwell brought 2 men from his church. Vernon Branham attended alone. Martha was too ill to make the journey down from the ridge, and the other children had been left in her care. No minister officiated. The circuit court clerk performed the ceremony himself, a common practice for marriages where religious involvement was minimal or unwelcome. Church records from the Frozen Creek Methodist congregation contain no mention of the wedding. The pastor, who had baptized Nellie as an infant, apparently declined to participate despite the marriage's complete legality under state law. His silence spoke what his position prevented him from saying aloud. The certificate was signed, witnessed, and recorded. Nellie left the courthouse as Nellie Caldwell, legally bound to a man 30 years her senior. A neighbor later recalled seeing them that afternoon, Caldwell driving a wagon with Nellie sitting beside him, heading toward his property on the bottomland. She was carrying a small bundle that contained everything she owned. What happened in the months that followed exists primarily in fragments, pieces of documentation that together form a picture of what life became for a 13-year-old girl suddenly thrust into the role of wife. Letters written by Martha Branham to her sister in Virginia, discovered during estate proceedings in 1928, provide the clearest window into this period. One letter, dated April of 1887, mentions that Martha had visited Nellie twice since the marriage. She wrote that the house was well built and the provisions adequate. Observations that focused carefully on material conditions while avoiding any mention of Nellie's state of mind. The letter concluded with a sentence that revealed everything it tried to conceal. I pray daily that Caldwell treats her with Christian mercy until she grows into her duties. Another letter from September of that same year contained more troubling implications. Martha wrote that she had not seen Nellie in 2 months because Caldwell prefers she remain at the house attending to her responsibilities. The isolation was not unusual for wives in that region, but for a girl barely 14. Cut off from her family and childhood, the loneliness must have been profound. The letter mentioned that Nellie was expecting a child, news delivered without celebration or joy, simply as fact. The 1890 census provides the next documented snapshot of Nellie's life. The census taker recorded her as Nellie Caldwell, age 16, living in Jasper Caldwell's household. 2 children were listed, a daughter aged 2 and a son aged 1. The notation was clinical, offering no insight into the reality those numbers represented. Nellie had borne 2 children by age 16, her body forced into motherhood before it had finished growing. A birth certificate filed in 1891 shows a 3rd child, another daughter. The attending physician noted complications during delivery, but provided no details. Medical records from rural areas in that period were notoriously sparse, and doctors rarely documented the full scope of problems they encountered, particularly when those problems stemmed from circumstances the law itself permitted. By age 17, Nellie Caldwell was mother to 3 children, wife to a man who had purchased her through legal transaction, and trapped in a life she had never chosen. The documents record her existence, but cannot capture what she endured. They show only that she survived these years, and that survival came at a cost no record could fully measure. Nellie Caldwell's story was not unique. It was not even unusual. Research conducted by the Kentucky Historical Society in the 1930s examined marriage records from 10 eastern Kentucky counties, spanning the years 1870 through 1900. The results revealed a pattern so consistent, it could only be described as systematic. Hundreds of marriages involving girls aged 12 to 15 and men over 30 were recorded in official county registers, each one as legally valid as any other marriage certificate filed during that period. Breathitt County alone recorded 47 such marriages during the 1880s. Letcher County documented 32. Pike County showed 51. The numbers climbed higher in counties where economic conditions were most desperate and geographic isolation most complete. These were not aberrations or scandals. They were routine administrative matters, processed by clerks who saw nothing requiring comment or intervention. A particularly revealing document surfaced during archival research in 1976. A county clerk from Perry County, interviewed for an oral history project before his death, recalled his father's tenure in the same position during the 1890s. The son remembered his father explaining that such marriages typically increased after harsh winters or poor harvests. Economic desperation drove the pattern. When families faced starvation, daughters became negotiable assets. The clerk's father had kept a private notation system, marking certain marriages with a small pencil dot in the margin of the register. When asked about these marks decades later, the son explained they indicated marriages where the clerk personally found the age difference troubling, even though the law permitted them. Out of 218 marriages recorded during his father's tenure, 63 bore these marks. but marking his private discomfort was the extent of any action taken. The law required only that proper consent be provided, and it was. Census records corroborate what marriage certificates documented. The 1890 census for Clay County shows multiple households headed by men in their 40s and 50s, with wives listed as teenagers and young children already in the home. One household recorded a 47-year-old farmer, his 16-year-old wife, and 3 children aged 4, 2, and infant. The arithmetic was unavoidable. The pattern extended beyond just Appalachian counties. Western Kentucky showed similar trends, though in slightly lower numbers. Marriage records from Henderson County and Union County reveal the same age disparities, the same economic circumstances, the same legal apparatus facilitating transactions that today would constitute criminal exploitation. Geography might vary, but the underlying dynamics remained constant. Poverty, patriarchal authority, and permissive laws created conditions where child marriage flourished across the entire state. Academic research conducted by sociologists at the University of Kentucky in 1934 included interviews with surviving participants from these marriages. Women who had been child brides in the 1880s and 90s spoke carefully about their experiences, their words shaped by decades of silence and the knowledge that questioning these arrangements meant questioning choices their own families had made. One woman, married at 13 in 1883, stated simply, "That was how things were done when families had too many mouths and not enough means. We did not speak of fairness. We spoke of survival." The documentation exists in volume too substantial to dismiss as isolated incidents. Marriage registers, census records, county clerk testimonies, and oral histories all point to the same conclusion. What happened to Nellie Branham happened to hundreds of other girls across Kentucky, facilitated by laws that prioritized parental authority and economic arrangements over the welfare of children caught in circumstances they could not escape. The teachers saw it happening. They recorded it in attendance books and private journals, documenting losses they were powerless to prevent. Education records filed with county superintendents in the 1880s and 90s contain a recurring pattern. Girls would attend school irregularly through autumn and winter, then vanish completely, usually around planting season or after particularly harsh weather. The teachers noted these absences with careful language that avoided direct accusation, but made the circumstances clear to anyone willing to see. Emma Caudill taught at the Frozen Creek Schoolhouse from 1882 through 1896. Her personal papers, donated to the Kentucky Historical Society after her death in 1931, include a handwritten list of 17 students who left school to marry during her tenure. She recorded each girl's name, her age at departure, and the age of the man she married. The youngest was 12 years old. Her husband was 36. Caudill's notes describe these girls with precision that suggests she knew them well. One entry reads, "Liza Combs, departed November 1887, aged 13, showed aptitude for mathematics, could cipher through long division, married to Samuel Holbrook, aged 41, widower with 6 children. She will raise his children now instead of receiving education that might have lifted her beyond subsistence." The teacher's frustration bleeds through the careful documentation. Another entry notes, "Sarah Bowling, aged 14, removed from school February 1889. Had memorized substantial portions of scripture and could recite poetry. Her father arranged marriage to settle debts with merchant. Girl wept at her desk the week before removal, but told no one the cause. We all understood anyway." These private papers reveal what public records could not. Caldwell documented not just the departures, but the impact on the girls who remained. She wrote that students became quiet and withdrawn when a classmate disappeared into marriage, particularly when that classmate had been younger than themselves. The girls understood their own vulnerability. They saw their future written in the absence of their peers. A report filed with the Breathitt County Superintendent in 1891 addressed the problem obliquely. Caldwell noted that female attendance dropped significantly among students aged 12 and above, particularly in families experiencing economic hardship. She recommended extending the school term and providing meals to encourage attendance, proposals that would address symptoms while carefully avoiding the underlying cause. The superintendent's response, preserved in the same file, acknowledged the attendance problem, but allocated no additional resources. The pattern would continue. Other teachers across eastern Kentucky left similar documentation. An educator from Wolfe County kept detailed records showing 9 girls removed from her schoolhouse for marriage between 1885 and 1892. A teacher in Leslie County noted in his annual report that the benefits of education for female students remain limited by early marriage customs that remove them from instruction before meaningful learning can occur. The educational consequences extended beyond just the individual girls. Birth records from the period show that daughters of child brides were themselves more likely to leave school early and marry young, perpetuating cycles that kept families locked in poverty and limited opportunity. Illiteracy rates remained stubbornly high in regions where child marriage was most common, creating generational patterns that would take decades to break. The teachers documented what they witnessed, but possessed no authority to intervene. Their role was to educate children who attended, not to question family decisions or challenge legal arrangements. They watched girls disappear into marriages that would destroy any chance of education, and they recorded those losses in careful script, testimonies to failures they could observe but not prevent. The death certificates tell the story that living voices could not. Archives at the Kentucky Historical Society contain mortality records spanning the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Among them are dozens of death certificates for women who had been child brides, their causes of death following patterns that medical professionals of the era documented but rarely discussed publicly. The most common cause listed was childbirth complications, a clinical term that concealed the brutal reality of bodies destroyed by pregnancies they were too young to sustain. Nellie Caldwell's death certificate was filed in Breathitt County on August 14, 1902. She was 28 years old. The cause of death was recorded as complications of childbirth, 7th pregnancy. The attending physician noted excessive bleeding, but provided no additional details. The certificate listed 6 living children, ages ranging from 15 years down to 2. One previous pregnancy had ended in stillbirth. The arithmetic was devastating. Nellie had been pregnant or recovering from childbirth for most of her marriage. Her first child was born when she was 14. Her body had never been given time to fully mature before it was forced into reproduction, then kept in that state almost continuously for 14 years. The complications that killed her were likely building throughout that entire period, her system breaking down incrementally under demands it was never meant to bear. Cemetery records from the Frozen Creek burial ground show Nellie was interred in a plot beside Caldwell's first wife, another woman who had died young, though from disease rather than childbirth. The stone marking Nellie's grave listed only her name, birth year, and death year. No mention of beloved wife or devoted mother, just the bare facts of existence. Her 6 children, ranging from toddler to teenager, were left in Caldwell's care. Medical journals from the period contained scattered references to what doctors were observing. An 1896 article in the Kentucky Medical Journal discussed maternal mortality rates among women under age 20, noting significantly higher death rates compared to women in their 20s. The article attributed this to physical immaturity and insufficient pelvic development, medical language for bodies too young to safely bear children. But the article stopped short of addressing why so many young women were experiencing these complications, carefully avoiding any mention of the marriage practices that created the problem. Death certificates for other child brides from that era show similar patterns. A girl married at 12 in Perry County died at 19 from childbed fever after her 4th birth. Another married at 13 in Letcher County died at 23. Her certificate noting exhaustion following prolonged labor. The causes varied in specifics, but pointed to the same underlying reality. These girls' bodies were being used up, worn down by repeated pregnancies before they had finished growing. The consequences extended beyond just mortality. Orphan court records from multiple counties show numerous cases of children left dependent on extended family or county poor farms after their young mothers died. These children often entered the same cycles of poverty and limited opportunity that had trapped their parents. Some of the daughters would themselves become child brides, perpetuating patterns across generations. Caldwell remarried in 1904, 2 years after Nellie's death. County records show his 3rd wife was 22 years old, notably older than his previous brides. Whether age and experience had taught him something, or whether community attitudes were finally beginning to shift, remains unclear. What is certain is that Nellie Caldwell spent her entire adult life bearing and raising children, and that life ended decades earlier than it should have, another casualty of laws that permitted exploitation to flourish under the guise of marriage. Change came slowly, resisted at every step by those who benefited from the old arrangements. The first serious attempt to reform Kentucky's marriage age laws appeared in the state legislature in 1892. A representative from Jefferson County introduced a bill that would raise the minimum marriage age to 14 with parental consent and 16 without. The bill died in committee, opposed by rural legislators who argued it would create unnecessary interference in family matters and regional customs. But pressure was building from multiple directions. Women's organizations in Louisville and Lexington had begun coordinating with national suffrage movements, and marriage age reform became part of their broader agenda. These groups understood that girls married at 12 or 13 would never receive education, would never develop independence, would remain trapped in cycles of dependency and reproduction that prevented any possibility of self-determination. Medical professionals added their voices, though more cautiously. The Kentucky Medical Association published a report in 1897 documenting maternal mortality rates among teenage mothers. The statistics were undeniable. Girls under 16 died in childbirth at rates significantly higher than women in their 20s. The report stopped short of directly criticizing marriage practices, instead framing the issue as a medical concern requiring legislative attention. The strategy was deliberate. Doctors understood that attacking established customs would alienate the rural communities they served, so they presented the problem as one of health rather than morality. Newspaper editorial pages began reflecting changing attitudes, at least in urban areas. The Louisville Courier-Journal ran a series in 1903 examining marriage practices in eastern Kentucky counties. The articles presented the facts without sensationalism, letting the numbers speak for themselves. One piece noted that in some counties, nearly 20% of marriages involved girls under 15. Another documented the correlation between child marriage rates and poverty, illiteracy, and maternal mortality. Legislative efforts continued throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Each attempt to raise marriage ages faced opposition, but the margins narrowed. A bill in 1907 passed the House, but failed in the Senate. Another effort in 1912 came within 3 votes of passage. The arguments against reform remained consistent. These laws would hurt poor families who depended on marriage arrangements for economic survival, would impose urban values on rural communities, would interfere with parental authority. But the social landscape was shifting. The generation of women who had been child brides in the 1880s and 90s were now adults, some willing to speak about their experiences. Oral histories collected in the 1920s include testimony from women who described marriages entered at 13 or 14 as arrangements we endured rather than chose. Their voices, combined with medical evidence and sustained advocacy from reform organizations, gradually eroded support for the old system. The breakthrough came in 1920. Kentucky raised the minimum marriage age to 16 with parental consent, 18 without. Violations could now result in prosecution, though enforcement remained inconsistent, particularly in isolated regions where old customs died hard. Court records from the 1920s show some prosecutions for statutory violations, a dramatic shift from the previous era when such arrangements had been not merely legal, but routine. The law had changed, but the damage spanned generations. Thousands of girls had been married as children under laws the state had created and maintained. Their lives, their health, their potential had been sacrificed to economic systems and patriarchal customs that legal reform came too late to save them from. The marriage certificate still exists in the Breathitt County archives, filed among thousands of other documents from that era. Jasper Caldwell's firm signature, Nellie Branham's careful letters, Vernon Branham's mark of consent, all perfectly legal, all utterly devastating. Modern historians examining these records face an uncomfortable truth. These were not hidden crimes or secret abuses. They were public transactions, facilitated by law, endorsed by custom, and recorded in official documents that survive today as testimony to what was once permissible. The certificate for Jasper Caldwell and Nellie Branham represents not an aberration, but a system, one that operated openly for decades while transforming children into wives and mothers before they had finished being children themselves. Research into Kentucky's 19th century marriage practices has forced a reckoning with how societies can normalize exploitation through legal mechanisms. When the law permits something, when custom endorses it, when economic desperation makes it seem necessary, even profound harm can become routine. Girls like Nellie existed within a framework that gave them no protection, no choice, no escape from arrangements their families made and the state sanctioned. Academic studies examining these historical patterns emphasize the importance of understanding context without excusing harm. The economic conditions in eastern Kentucky were genuinely desperate. Families faced real starvation, real debt, real consequences if they could not find ways to survive. But desperation does not transform exploitation into something acceptable. It simply reveals how vulnerability gets weaponized when legal systems prioritize property rights and patriarchal authority over human dignity. The patterns extended far beyond marriage age. These same legal and social structures permitted other forms of control and abuse, all justified through similar reasoning about custom, necessity, and family autonomy. Understanding how child marriage functioned in 19th century Kentucky illuminates broader truths about how power operates, how laws can facilitate rather than prevent harm, and how normalizing language masks the reality of what is being done. Nellie Caldwell died at 28, her body worn out from bearing children she began having at 14. Her 6 surviving children grew up in the same poverty that had trapped their mother, several of her daughters entering marriages while still in their teens. The cycles perpetuated themselves across generations, enabled by laws that took decades to change and customs that persisted even longer. The archival evidence stands as testimony to real lives, real suffering, real girls whose childhoods ended through legal mechanisms that today we recognize as fundamentally wrong. Social acceptance and legal permissibility do not equal moral rightness. The fact that something can be done, that law allows it, and custom endorses it, does not make it acceptable. History teaches this lesson repeatedly, but each generation must learn it anew. The marriage certificate remains in the archives, a documented example of practices that once flourished throughout Kentucky and across much of America. It serves as a reminder that legal systems can enable terrible harm, that vulnerability based on age, gender, and poverty has always been exploited, and that progress requires confronting uncomfortable truths about what our predecessors permitted and participated in. This is the story we must remember. Not to condemn those caught in impossible circumstances, but to understand how systems of exploitation function and persist. The past cannot be changed, but it can teach us to recognize when law and custom serve power rather than justice. If this story disturbed you as much as it should have, click that like button. Subscribe to this channel, because we're not finished uncovering the truths that history tried to bury. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that just because something was legal doesn't mean it was right. The archives are full of stories like Nellie's, and every single one of them deserves to be told.